The church was full. Every pew packed shoulder to shoulder with people in their Sunday best, hats held in laps, boots polished to a shine they hadn't seen since Christmas. Sunlight came through the two small windows on either side of the altar, warm, golden, almost too perfect. Outside, the wind had finally died down after 3 days of blowing dust across the plains. Even the weather had cooperated. Even the sky had softened. Up at the altar, a man named Cole Duren stood with his back straight and his heart hammering. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet face that made people trust him without knowing why. His hands were clasped in front of him. His hair was combed. He was wearing the only suit he owned, dark wool, bought secondhand from a tailor in Harlan 3 years back, let out once at the shoulders because he'd filled out since then. He was nervous, not the kind of nervous that makes a man want to run. The other kind. The kind where everything you've ever wanted is standing just around the corner, and you're afraid that if you breathe too loud, it might disappear. Pastor Elwood was smiling at him. The congregation was murmuring and shuffling. A baby cried somewhere in the back row and was quickly shushed. Everything felt exactly the way a wedding morning is supposed to feel. Then the side door opened, and the maid of honor leaned in and gave a small nod. The piano began, and Cole Duren, cattle hand turned ranch foreman, son of nobody important, a man who had spent most of his life sleeping under open skies with nothing but a bedroll and a quarter horse. That man straightened even taller, and something warm moved behind his eyes. She was coming. He could hear the slow creak of the church's front doors opening from the outside. He could hear the rustle of the congregation rising to their feet. He could hear the piano notes filling up the space beneath the rafters, steady and sweet. He didn't turn around yet. He was waiting for the right moment. That's the kind of man Cole was. Patient, careful with things that mattered. And then, before he could turn, before the music could swell the way it was supposed to, the doors opened a second time. Not from the front, where the bride was walking in. From the back. A hard, sudden push. Both doors swinging wide. The piano stopped. Not gradually. Just stopped. Mid-note. The congregation didn't gasp at first. They just went still in the way that people go still when something is wrong, but no one has yet figured out what is. That half-second of collective confusion, where the mind is still trying to decide what it's seeing. A man stood in the doorway. He was trail-worn in a way that went beyond dust and mileage. There was something about his posture, something about the set of his jaw, that said this man had ridden a long way on purpose. He was not young, but not old either. Maybe 45, with a flat brim hat pulled low and a coat that had seen weather. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He didn't need to. In his left hand, held out to the side like an offering, or an accusation, was a folded piece of paper. He stepped inside. His boots hit the wooden floor one deliberate step at a time. The congregation parted without meaning to. Heads turning, necks craning, people leaning to see what was in his hand. He stopped in the center aisle, and then he unfolded the paper and held it up. It was a wanted poster. The drawing on it was rough. They always were, but it was close enough. The eyes were right. The line of the jaw. The specific way the hair fell. It was her. Beneath the drawing, the words were printed in heavy black ink. Wanted, dead or alive, Eleanor Voss for murder. Cole turned around. He saw the poster. He saw the bride, standing frozen halfway down the aisle in her white dress with the small yellow flowers sewn along the collar, bouquet held in both hands, face gone the color of the church walls. He looked at the poster. He looked at her. And for a moment, just a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Cole Duren was before that morning. Because this wasn't just a story about a wedding interrupted. It was a story about a man who had spent years learning to trust his own judgment, and then had to decide, in the span of a few terrible seconds, whether that judgment had failed him completely. Cole had come to the town of Morrow Creek 6 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, a skinning knife, and the recommendation of a foreman 2 counties over who owed him a favor. He'd hired on with Hezekiah Crane's cattle operation as a regular hand, and worked himself up from there. Hezekiah Crane was the kind of man that small towns are built around and sometimes broken by. He was 63 years old, still hard in the way that old ranchers are hard, not from fighting, but from decades of work and weather and loss. He'd lost a wife to fever when his daughter was only 4 years old. He'd lost 2 hired men to a flash flood in '79. He'd lost a year's worth of cattle to drought in '83. He didn't talk about any of it. He just kept working and kept building and kept the kind of silence around himself that meant people didn't ask questions. He owned the biggest spread in the county. Not bragging big, just quietly, solidly enormous, the kind of land ownership that made men respectful in a way that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with math. You didn't cross Hezekiah Crane. Not because he was violent, because he was patient, and patient men in the West had a way of outlasting everyone else. His daughter was named Clara. Clara Crane was 24 years old, and she had grown up on that ranch the way wild things grow when they're given enough space. Strong and quietly confident, and a little difficult to contain. She could ride better than most of the hands. She could mend fence, brand cattle, and read weather by the look of the clouds in a way that took most people years to learn. She'd had a brief period of schooling in her early teens, when Hezekiah had sent her to board with a teacher in the county seat, and she'd come back speaking better than most of the town and reading everything she could find. But she wasn't pretentious about it. She just carried it quietly, the way she carried most things. The town of Morrow Creek loved her, not in the fawning way that people sometimes love the daughters of wealthy men. In the genuine way, the way that comes from small acts over years. She brought medicine to sick families. She helped with harvests when neighbors ran short of hands. She never held her father's land above anyone's head, even when she could have. Cole had noticed her in the way that a careful man notices things, slowly, and without letting himself say too much about it. For the first 2 years, she was simply the rancher's daughter. He was respectful and distant in the way a hired man should be. But Hezekiah Crane had a habit of putting Cole in situations that required more than hired man thinking. He put him in charge of the crew, then in charge of the whole spring drive, then in charge of negotiations with a buyer from 2 counties east. Every time, Cole had handled it quietly and well, and every time, Hezekiah had watched from a distance with that flat, appraising look of his and said nothing. It was Clara who finally said something. It was an evening in late October, 2 years into Cole's time at the ranch. They'd been repairing a section of fence along the creek that the autumn floods had knocked down, and the light was going fast, and Cole was still working when most of the other men had already headed back to the bunkhouse for supper. She'd ridden out to check the work, which wasn't unusual. She checked everything. She sat on her horse and watched him work for a minute without saying anything, which was also not unusual. Then she said, "You don't have to prove anything, you know." He kept working for a moment before he answered, "I know. Do you?" He finally looked up at her then. She was sitting easy in the saddle, the last of the daylight behind her, and she had an expression on her face that was neither soft nor hard, just honest. "I prove it for myself," he said. "Not for him. Not for anyone else." She studied him a moment longer. Then she nodded and turned her horse and rode back toward the house. But she looked back once. He noticed. That was how it started. Not with big declarations or dramatic moments, but with small ones. Conversations at the edge of the day. Shared silence during long rides. The slow accumulation of small trusts that eventually became something neither of them had quite planned on. By the following spring, Hezekiah knew. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally did, he called Cole into the house one evening after supper and sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "You're a decent man, Cole." Cole waited. "I've known a lot of men in my life," Hezekiah said. "Most of them weren't. You are." He paused. "That doesn't mean I'm easy about this." "I know," Cole said. "But I trust my daughter's judgment," Hezekiah said. "And she doesn't give it lightly." That was it. That was the blessing. No handshake. No formal words. Just that. And somehow it meant more than ceremony would have. Over the next 2 years, Cole and Clara built something careful and real. He proposed on a November evening with the first frost of the season on the ground, and no ring yet. He told her the ring was coming, but the question couldn't wait. She laughed, which was not the response he'd expected, and then said yes, which was the only one he'd hoped for. The ring came 3 weeks later. Simple gold. It fit. The wedding was planned for early June. Here is what Cole remembered about those months leading up to the wedding, looking back on it later. Not the big things, the small ones. The way Clara sometimes went quiet in the middle of conversations, not distracted quiet, but somewhere else quiet. The way she'd occasionally scan the faces of strangers passing through town with the particular kind of attention, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but not subtle enough that Cole, who paid attention to her the way you pay attention to the land you live on, could miss entirely. There was the letter that arrived in late April. She'd been standing at the front of the house when the mail rider came through, and she'd flipped through the envelopes with the quick efficiency of someone expecting nothing, and then she'd gone still. When Cole came around the side of the house a minute later, she was reading a piece of paper with her back to him, and he'd said her name, and she'd folded it fast, too fast, and put it in her skirt pocket, and turned with a smile that was real but had something else behind it. He'd asked if everything was all right. She'd said yes, just a note from an old school friend. Nothing important. He believed her. He'd had no reason not to. There was also the night, 2 weeks before the wedding, when he'd woken in the small hours and heard movement in the house. He was staying in the small room off the kitchen that Hezekiah had offered him after they'd gotten engaged, more respectable than the bunkhouse, close enough to keep an eye on things. He'd heard footsteps and the creak of the front door, and he'd gotten up to look, and through the window he'd seen Clara, standing on the front porch in the dark, looking out toward the road, just standing there, still, watching. He'd gone back to bed. He'd told himself she was restless, the way people get before weddings, the way anyone would get. He thought about that later. He thought about it a lot. The morning of the wedding, Cole had been so focused on the day ahead of him that he hadn't noticed the horse tied at the edge of town. He hadn't noticed the stranger eating alone at the far end of the counter at the hotel's small dining room when he'd gone in to get a cup of coffee that morning. He hadn't noticed the way the man's eyes tracked him when he walked in, and then went carefully flat when Cole looked his direction. He'd thought nothing of any of it, because on wedding mornings, the world narrows down to a point, and that point for Cole Duren was Clara. Now back to that moment in the church. The stranger was still standing in the center aisle with the poster held up, and the congregation was beginning to make noise in the way crowds make noise when shock turns into something louder. Not quite panic, but the rumble before it. Hezekiah Crane, seated in the front pew, had risen to his feet. His face was not what Cole expected. He'd expected anger, confusion, the outrage of a father. But Hezekiah's face was something else. It was fear. Cole had never seen that look on Hezekiah Crane's face before. Not once in 6 years. And that, more than the poster, more than anything else, was what made the ice settle in the center of Cole's chest. Because if this man knew something that could make Hezekiah Crane afraid, then whatever it was real. Pastor Elwood was speaking, trying to restore order, his voice rising above the din in the uncertain way of a man who conducts marriages and funerals but isn't equipped for this. People were standing now. The murmuring had become fragments of words, questions and accusations half-formed, thrown across the pews. Cole turned fully around to face the aisle. Clara hadn't moved. She was still standing where the music had stopped her, flowers in her hands, dress white in the gold light, and she was looking at the stranger with an expression that Cole could not immediately read. It wasn't guilt exactly. It wasn't shock either. It was something in between. The look of someone watching a thing happen that they had always known might eventually come. That was what broke something open in Cole's chest. Not the poster. That look. Because it wasn't surprise. He took 3 slow steps toward her. The congregation went quieter. He said very quietly, "Clara." Her eyes came to him then, and they were full, not of tears yet, but of the kind of pressure that comes before tears. She opened her mouth, said nothing. The stranger spoke instead. "Her name isn't Clara Crane," he said. His voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he walked through that door and was now simply saying it. "Her name is Eleanor Voss, from Colton County. And 3 years before she turned up here, there was a man found dead on her family's property with 2 bullets in his chest. The sheriff ruled it a killing. Grand jury handed down an indictment." He paused. She ran before the trial. The church had gone very still. Cole didn't look at the stranger. He kept his eyes on Clara. "Is that your name?" he asked. A long pause. Then quietly, "It was." The sound that went through the congregation then was not loud. It was almost soft. The soft sound of a town's certainty about something cracking down the middle. Cole didn't raise his voice. "Is it true? What are you saying?" Her chin trembled once, and then she stopped it. She squared her shoulders in the white dress that she had sewn herself, that she had sat up late, finishing 3 nights before the wedding, that had the small yellow flowers along the collar she'd told him were her mother's favorite. "Not the way he's telling it," she said. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not what anyone in that church had expected. Cole held up one hand, not toward Clara, but toward the room. It was a simple gesture. Still, it said everyone stop. And somehow, in the way that a calm voice can quiet a crowd before it fully forms into one, the room listened. He turned to the stranger then for the first time and looked at him straight. "Who are you?" he asked. The man let the poster drop slightly. "Name's Aldous Vane. I'm a recovery agent out of Colton County." "Recovery agent," Cole repeated. "Bounty hunter," someone in the pews said, as if translating. "I have a lawful warrant," Vane said. He reached slowly into his coat and produced a folded document, signed and sealed. "The woman is wanted on a murder charge. I have authority to take her back to stand trial." Cole didn't take the document. He looked at it in the man's hand and then looked at him. "You rode in here and interrupted a wedding to collect your bounty." "I rode in here to uphold the law." Cole looked at him a moment longer with those quiet eyes of his, the same eyes that had evaluated 1,000 head of cattle, that had read weather and terrain and the intentions of difficult men. Then he said simply, "Give her a moment." Vane stiffened. "That's not how." "I'm not asking about how," Cole said. "I'm saying give her a moment." Something in the room shifted. This was still Cole Duren, a man that Morrow Creek knew, a man that Morrow Creek had watched and trusted for years. And when he said a thing with that particular quiet in his voice, people tended to listen, even when they weren't sure why. Vane didn't move, but he didn't speak either. Cole walked to Clara. He stopped in front of her, close enough to speak low, and looked at her face. The bouquet was still in her hands, though her grip had gone tight. She was holding herself together with visible effort, and it was costing her. "Tell me what happened," he said. She held his gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, "The man's name was Russell Tate. He wasn't just some man. He was my father's business partner. And he had been." She stopped, drew a breath. "He'd been coming to our property for 2 years, when my father wasn't there. He'd made it very clear what he wanted. I'd said no. Every time." Her voice was steady. "Barely. The night he died, he came to the property, and my father wasn't home. I was alone. He didn't take no for an answer that time." Silence. Cole didn't look away from her. "I shot him," she said. "I shot him twice, because the first time he was still coming at me." She met his eyes. "I am not sorry that he's dead, but I have been sorry every day since that I had to be the one to make him that way." The quiet in the church was absolute. "Why didn't you go to trial?" Cole asked. Something passed through her expression then, older, darker, more tired than anything he'd seen on her face before. "Because my father's business partner sat on the county board," she said. "Because the sheriff owed Tate money. Because the witnesses they were going to call were all Tate's men, and they had a story that was nothing like what actually happened." She paused. "My father put me on a horse in the middle of the night and told me to ride and not look back. He told me he would handle it, that he would clear my name." She glanced back, just once, toward Hezekiah Crane, and Cole finally understood the look on the old man's face. Hezekiah hadn't been afraid of what was being revealed. He'd been afraid of what it would cost Clara, because Hezekiah Crane was not her father by blood. He was the man who had taken her in, given her a name, given her a life, kept a secret, and carried it for 3 years because he believed, in the patient, long-horizon way that he believed all things, that time and distance would eventually make it safe. He'd been wrong. Cole straightened and turned back to Aldous Vane. The bounty hunter had been watching and listening without expression. He was a professional. He'd seen things like this before. He'd learned not to be moved by them. But there was something Cole had noticed while Clara was talking. Something small. The warrant. Vane had been holding it loosely since Cole had declined to take it, and in that time Cole had gotten a better look at the paper. He'd handled enough legal documents over the years, land deeds, cattle transfers, bills of sale, contracts, to know what they generally looked like. And there was something about the paper in Vane's hand that wasn't sitting right. "Can I see that warrant?" Cole said. Not a question. Vane hesitated, just briefly. Then he extended it. Cole took it, unfolded it, and read. The congregation was quiet enough that the sound of the paper was audible. Cole read it twice. Then he looked up. "This warrant is 3 years old," he said. Vane's expression didn't change. "Warrants don't expire." "No," Cole said. "They don't." He folded the paper slowly. "But they do get superseded when a case is closed." A pause. Cole's eyes moved to him with particular steadiness. "Because there's another thing I know about legal documents. When a county board changes hands, when a new sheriff takes office, old proceedings can be reviewed. Cases can be reopened and re-examined." He handed the warrant back. "I'd like to know when the last time anyone in Colton County actually looked at this case was." It was a question, but it landed like something harder. Vane's composure, for the first time, had a very small crack in it. Nothing most people would have seen. But Cole saw it. He turned to the congregation. He found the face he was looking for, Martin Stills, who had served 2 terms on the county council before retiring to Morrow Creek, who still corresponded regularly with men in positions of civic authority 3 counties, in every direction, because that was simply what Martin Stills did. "Martin," Cole said. The old man was already rising from his pew with the straightened posture of a man who knew he was being called on for something real. "Could you find out by tomorrow morning whether the proceedings in Colton County against a woman named Eleanor Voss are still active?" Cole asked. "And whether the men who brought those charges are still in the offices they held 3 years ago?" Martin Stills looked from Cole to the bounty hunter to Clara and back to Cole. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who understands the weight of a request and doesn't use more words than necessary. "I'll send a wire this afternoon." Now came the part that no one in that church could have predicted, because Aldous Vane did something that bounty hunters, in Cole's limited experience, did not generally do. He looked at Clara Crane, Eleanor Voss, standing in her white wedding dress in the middle of that church, and something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, not regret exactly, something more like the look of a man doing a difficult accounting. He reached into his coat again, not for a weapon, for another piece of paper. This one he unfolded himself and looked at for a moment before he spoke. "There was a second development," Vane said, and his voice was slightly different now, flatter in a way that suggested he was working to keep it that way. "About 8 months ago. New county sheriff. Name of Garrett Beale. He inherited the office from a man named Pickett, who retired under circumstances that the county council wasn't particularly proud of." He paused. Sheriff Beale reopened about a dozen cases from the Pickett years. This one was among them. The church was so quiet you could hear the horses outside. Beale found a report that the original deputy filed the night of the shooting. Vane continued. Not the official report, the one the deputy actually wrote before Pickett told him to rewrite it. He set the paper down on the back of the nearest pew. The deputy's account supports her story entirely. There were also 2 witnesses, ranch hands who worked the neighboring property, whose statements were never entered into the record. Clara made a sound that she immediately controlled. Just barely. Sheriff Beale issued a formal statement clearing her of the charge 4 months ago. Vane said. The indictment was vacated. The silence held for a full 3 seconds. Then Cole said, very quietly, "Then why are you here?" Vane looked at him. The flat professional composure was still in place, but something behind it had shifted enough to notice. "Because I had a contract," he said, "issued before the case was closed. I didn't know about the dismissal until I was already most of the way here." He paused. "I found out 2 days ago, in the last town before this one." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "And you came anyway?" Vane said nothing. "You came anyway," Cole said again, not louder, but with a different weight, knowing the charge had been cleared. knowing there was no warrant anymore. You walked into this church with a poster of a woman who has been legally exonerated, and you held it up in front of every person she knows. The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone. Vane looked, for just a moment, like a man who had convinced himself of something on the road and was now, in the room, no longer fully convinced. He said, I wanted to see who she was now, what kind of life she'd made. Cole didn't say anything. I knew her, Vane said. Before. Not well, but I knew the Voss family. I knew what happened to her. Something moved in his face, something harder to categorize. I wanted to know if she was all right. Another pause. That's a strange way to check on someone, Cole said. Vane picked up the paper from the pew. He folded it. He folded the original warrant as well, and he put both of them back in his coat. Then he looked at Clara, at Eleanor, and he said, The charge is gone. The record is clear. For what it's worth. He paused. I'm sorry about how I chose to deliver that news. And then he picked up his hat from where he'd held it, placed it back on his head, and walked back down the aisle, and out through the church doors, and into the June morning, and the sound of his boots on the porch steps was the last they heard of him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Pastor Elwood, God bless him, cleared his throat. Well, he said, in the careful voice of a man who has decided that normalcy is the best medicine for most situations. I believe we were in the middle of something. Someone in the back pew laughed. Not meanly. Just the helpless kind of laugh that comes out when tension has been wound too tight and is suddenly, improbably released. Then a few more people laughed. And then the murmuring started again, but it was a different kind now. The sound of people turning to each other and exhaling and processing. The sound of a room that had been afraid and is now, mostly relieved. But Cole and Clara were not laughing. Cole was still standing close to her in the center of the aisle, and he was looking at her face with the concentrated, quiet attention of a man who has just learned something large and is still integrating it. She was watching him, watching his face, specifically, with the particular focus of someone waiting for a verdict they believe they have coming. He said, Is there anything else? Anything I don't know? She held his gaze and she thought, and he watched her think, and he gave her the time to do it honestly. I was 17 years old, she said. I was alone on that property, and I defended myself. And then I ran because I was told to, and I built a life here, and I am. She stopped. I am the same person who said yes to your question in November, the same person who has been beside you for 2 years. My name was different. My past was hidden. She paused. But nothing I showed you was false. Cole looked at her. The church was listening, and it knew it shouldn't be, and it listened anyway because that is what people do when something real is happening in front of them. Cole Duren, who had spent his life being careful, who had learned early that the most important things required patience, who had come to this town with nothing and had built something real here. That man reached out and took the bouquet from her hands. He held it awkwardly for a moment because he didn't know what to do with flowers, and somehow that was the most human thing anyone had ever seen him do. He handed it to the nearest person in the front pew, who happened to be Hezekiah Crane, who took it without a word. Then Cole took Clara's hands in his. They were cold. He held them tighter. He turned to Pastor Elwood. Whenever you're ready, he said. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't be, after that. The rest of the ceremony had a different quality to it. Quieter, more concentrated. The way that things are when they've been tested before they're completed. Some of the joy had been replaced with something heavier and more honest, which, as it turned out, suited both of them better anyway. When Cole said the words, he said them looking directly at her, and she held his eyes without looking away, and both of them understood that they were agreeing to something more specific than vows usually require. When she said the words, her voice was steady, completely steady, and those who knew Clara Eleanor understood that was not nothing. Pastor Elwood pronounced them married. The church applauded. Hezekiah Crane, still holding the bouquet in his big weathered hands, was the last to start and the last to stop, because he was not given to demonstrating feeling. But when he did, it meant something. Outside the church, in the bright June morning with the smell of grass and horse and river in the air, people stood in small groups and talked the way people do after something unexpected, with the energy that comes from having experienced something together, something that will be the reference point for years. You remember the Duren wedding. You remember when that man walked in with the poster. Martin Stills, true to his word, sent his wire that afternoon. The reply came the following morning. The case against Eleanor Voss had indeed been formally vacated 4 months prior. The county record had been corrected. There was nothing pending. Hezekiah sat with Cole on the porch that evening. The night after the wedding, Clara inside sleeping the sleep of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. And the two men sat in the settling dark without speaking for a long while. Eventually Hezekiah said, "I should have told you." Cole said, "Yes." Another silence. "She didn't want you to know before you married her," Hezekiah said. "She was afraid you'd refuse her." Cole thought about that. Then he said, "I understand why she thought that. Does that make it easier?" Cole considered the question honestly. "No," he said, "but it makes it make sense." Hezekiah nodded slowly. The way he nodded things, as if agreement were a physical weight being shifted. "She's had to be strong for a long time," the old man said. "Stronger than she should have had to be that young." Cole looked out at the dark. "She won't have to do it alone anymore," he said. It wasn't a big declaration. It wasn't meant to be. But Hezekiah heard it the way it was meant, and he said nothing more, which was his version of everything. "There's one more thing to tell. About 2 months after the wedding, a letter arrived for Clara. Cole handed it to her across the breakfast table without looking at the return address, and she turned it over, and something in her expression changed. The return address was Colton County. She opened it carefully. "Read it." Then she set it down on the table and looked out the window for a moment. Cole waited. She said, "The deputy who wrote the original report, the honest one, before they made him rewrite it. His name is Everett Coles. He left the sheriff's office the year after it happened. He's been farming." She paused. "He wrote to apologize." Cole said nothing. "He said he's been wanting to write for 3 years, Clara said. "He said he knew what really happened. He said he was young, and he was afraid of what Pickett would do to him if he stood by what he'd seen." She folded the letter slowly. "He said he hoped I had found a good life somewhere." A long pause. "Will you write back?" Cole asked. She thought about it. "Yes. What will you say?" She turned the letter over once in her hands, and then she set it down and looked at him with those direct eyes of hers, the ones that had first made him feel, 2 years into knowing her, that here was a person who didn't have time for pretending. "I'll say that she did," Clara said, "that she found a very good life. There are old stories from the West that get told the wrong way. They get told as if justice was always swift and villains were obvious, and the innocent always had time to explain themselves before things went wrong. But the real West wasn't like that. The real West was complicated, and it moved fast, and it didn't always wait for the truth to catch up. Eleanor Voss had run at 17 with a dead man behind her and a story that no one in power was willing to hear. She had built a life on borrowed time, on a borrowed name, on the quiet hope that distance was enough. It almost wasn't. A man with a worn-out warrant and a long ride had nearly taken it all apart on the best morning of her life. But here's the thing about careful men and careful women. Cole Duren did not stop asking questions when the first answer arrived. He kept going slowly, in the way that he did everything, until the real shape of the thing was visible. And what he found, when the dust had cleared and the stranger had ridden out and the congregation had gone home and the day had finally ended, was this. The woman he'd married was exactly who he believed her to be. She had made a choice at 17 in a moment of fear and survival. She had lived with it, and she had built something honest on the far side of it. And she had loved him, carefully, genuinely, in the specific and unflashy way that serious people love. The name was different. The story had taken longer to tell, but the person was the same. That morning in the church, with the doors thrown open and the piano silent, and every eye in Morrow Creek turned toward her, Clara Crane, Eleanor Voss, whoever she was, had stood in her white dress with the small yellow flowers along the collar, and she had not run. She had stood there and let it come, because she was done running. And Cole, who had watched her do it, who had seen the particular kind of courage it takes to stay still when every instinct says move, Cole understood, in a way he couldn't have articulated then, but would carry for the rest of his life. That he had not made a mistake. He had been right about her from the beginning. The only thing he'd missed was the part of her story she hadn't yet been ready to tell. And in the end, standing on the porch in the dark with the old rancher beside him, and the sound of the planes settling into the night, that felt like something he could live with. More than that, it felt like something worth everything it had cost to get there.